So, welcome everyone to this webinar. As mentioned earlier, this will be in English because there are several guests, participants, attendants that are joining us from non-Latin American countries. And this is co-sponsored by Wapor Global. So, in order to have a larger impact, we agreed to have this hosted in English, but there's an instruction in the chat function where you could put subtitles. Existe una función de cómo subtitular en el idioma español o portugués esta sesión que está compartida ahí en el chat como texto, así que les agradecemos si nos acompañan con las presentaciones en inglés en función de los invitados que no son de América Latina, ya que es un webinar compartido con Wapor Global y el resto de las presentaciones va a ser en inglés. So this is our last webinar of Latin America, of the Latin American chapter of Wapor. Wapor stands for the World Association for Public Opinion Research. And the last webinar in this year, 2024, it is our 6th webinar. So it's been quite active for our organizations on average, one webinar every 2 months, paving the road to the main event of our organizations, which will be the 11th Congress of Wapor Latin America on Public Opinion Research. The hot site for the event is shared within the screen. It's Wapor Latam 2025, one word, waporlatam2025.org. This promises to be the largest and best event on public opinion research and research on political behavior and communication for the region. We already have 33 special sessions confirmed. So far, 110 paper proposals, and we expect some 20 to 30 more. Then we will close it, and the deadline for sending your abstract for either a paper or a poster will expire in December 20th. So we have like 10 more days for doing that. It will be a super opportunity for exchanging ideas, participating fully in the debate that promises to be of super quality because of the profile of the people that has already confirmed attendance. There's also another reminder related to registration. The discount of 20% for registration to the conference expires on January the 1st. These rates, I'd like to remember that it includes, in addition to full access to all the activities of the Congress, your choosing of 2 out of 5 free workshops that will be offered, that actually are offered during the conference, plus coffee breaks, cocktails, etc. That will also include your membership to Wapor Latam till the end of 2025. The membership has many benefits. I'll strongly recommend you to visit our website, waporlatinoamerica.org, such as access to the Revista Latinoamericana de Opinión Pública, RLOP, to the newsletter of Wapor Latam, exclusive discounts with the school methods of the Pompeu Fabra University, the Qualitativa platform, the Market Research Institute International, and the conferences of numerous allies, such as ABCP, the Brazilian Association for Political Science, ALACIP, the Latin American Association for Political Science, SAIMO, the Market Research and Public Opinion Association of Argentina, ESOMAR, which is the European, and actually stands as the World Association for Market Research. So, and there's a lot more of benefits and advantages. So again, I strongly recommend you to visit our website at Wapor Latinoamerica, one word, .org, ORG. So what is the context that brings us to this webinar? We had a year that have seen most voters or most individuals than in any other year going to the ballots, voting, and with these opportunities, electoral opportunities, we had an incredible, huge amount of polls, and with the polls, we have an incredible, huge amount of critical reviews by media and spin doctors, observers, etc., about the gap between what the polls project and what the electoral results end up being. And usually, this is handled by making emphasis mostly on methodological or technical issues, even though our association, probably most people that are joining us in as participants for this conference, for this webinar, are political scientists or sociologists or come from social science backgrounds. And the political factor, the political explanations are completely overlooked. So this will be a very timely and profitable opportunity to focus back on the political aspects that explain differences between what some polls project and the results of elections. Of course, we as a Wapor have put a lot of emphasis on some institutional factors such as bans on polls, regulatory measures that forbids the diffusion, the public diffusion of polling results conducted on the very last day or on the very last week of elections. And bans on polls are particularly extensive and frequent and large in Latin America. We only have so far 2 countries that do not forbid polls. One is Brazil, the other one is Guatemala. All the other ones have either a few days of bans or a couple of weeks at least, such as Chile. So, but we also have another contextual and institutional factors that influence, such as the booming market of fake polls, which are used by campaigns or candidacies or candidates for influencing and shaping the political humor, the political climate of previous to elections. Just to mention briefly, in Brazil, we went from 7,000 polls in 2016 to 14 or over 14,000 polls in this year. And in some cases, for some institutes, 3/4 of the polls that they conduct are self-funded. That is, apparently there's no candidate, there's no client behind that. And usually these self-funded polls are the ones that offer results that go far away from the ultimate results and from the average of those institutions that those polling firms that have more tradition and more capabilities for conducting polls. So clearly, there's a lot of politics intervening in this gap between poll projections and results. So the idea to bring Fred, Fernando, Seth here is to discuss these particular factors, not just contextual or institutional, also at the individual level, such as strategic voting or late decision, and forces that we cannot neglect. And certainly there's a few people more qualified than Fred, Seth, or Fernando to illuminate these topics with us. So without further delay, let me introduce the speakers. Fred Batista is Associate Professor at University of North Carolina, Charlotte, Fred is also a member of the Latin American Studies programs and affiliate faculty in the School of Data Science at UNC, University of North Carolina. He has been working in the fields of comparative politics, political psychology, research methods, with a focus on voting behaviors, opinions about gender and politics, and political information. Among the many journals that Fred's work has been published, stands out Revista Latinoamericana de Opinión Pública. And Ryan, big hoo for Ryan, who is the editor of the Revista, and that makes us all so proud. Fernando Meireles will be our second speaker, and he's professor of political science at the Institute for Social Science and Political Studies, and a partner at Instituto Quest, which is one of the most active and visible and reputable institutions doing polling research in Brazil. And his research examines how political institutions and elections shape representation using a combination of machine learning, causal inference, and survey methods. And finally, we have the great pleasure of having Seth Soderborg with us. He has a PhD in government by Harvard University, and currently he's senior researcher at Indicator Politic in Indonesia. He's joining us from Timor-Leste. He understands Portuguese very well, and he has an extensive background on doing research related to campaign messages and targeted plans for clients in presidential and legislative races using survey experiments, focus group testing, and machine learning models in the US, but also in Brazil. So most welcome to have your insight from Indonesia, Brazil, or the US. Each speaker will have up to 15 minutes for presentation. Then Ryan will be Ryan Carlin, the editor of the Revista Latinoamericana, will handle the question and answers. Constanza Silly, which is also a member of the board of directors of Wapor Latam, will join us in case there's a need for some help. Please send your questions using the Q&A or the chat buttons. Por favor, durante toda la presentación, se sientan a gusto, con libertad, para mandar sus preguntas a los presentadores utilizando la función chat o la función de preguntas y respuestas Q&A, QIA. En el chat también está una instrucción de cómo poner los subtítulos en el idioma de su preferencia. Así que aquellos que prefieran acompañar con la traducción simultánea en forma de subtítulos, de leyenda, por favor sigan las instrucciones y actívenlo. Well, I'm took over 10 minutes for doing that. Sorry for that. But it's really exciting to have you here. So please, Fred, I'll hand the floor to you.
Thank you, Fabian. I can just go ahead and share my slides, right?
Yeah, I will need you after you're done. If you could share the hosting to Fernando, and then we'll do the same with Seth.
Okay. So
now you're host.
Okay. So I'm gonna go full screen here. So thank you, Fabian, for inviting. Thank you, everyone. Well, I did my translation. I saw that there was a preference for having the slides translated to Spanish. So I use my Portuñol, and my Portuguese is already very bad. I'm from Minas. I'm a Mineiro, so it's very quick. That doesn't help. So I apologize for any mistakes for last-minute translation to Spanish, but I'm going to be presenting in English. So what I'm going to do here today, in this brief time that we have, instead of presenting a piece of data that I've had, and I have a paper with Felipe Nunes from Quest, published, I don't know, a year ago on strategic voting and these aspects. I'm going to mention that. What I want to do is actually try to, since Fernando and Seth are going to present after me, try to organize some of these problems in what I think is a critical issue with polls in Latin America. and with a large focus in Brazil, given the way they're conducted in the region. So I'm going to start from what's the problem here that brings us here. The problem are the discrepancies, very constant and increasingly more, I'd say, noticeable. I'm not sure they are more constant than before. That's something we got to discuss. But they are very frequent between polling estimates and electoral results in Latin America, not just Latin America. And of course, I'm here in the US. That's a discussion in the US, very salient one about polling, but it's different in the US. I'll get to the US at some point. We can talk about it, but I want to focus on how it's done in Latin America, because the way polls are conducted in Latin America and reported is very different from what the US model. So what do I mean when I say poll estimates in Latin America? I'm talking about a few basic features. There may be more. You can help me with those if I'm forgetting something, right? So first, they seek to be representative, whatever that means, representative of the electorate. So you take a sample of registered voters that you're trying to replicate or reproduce in your study. They consist of individualized interviews. You interview individuals, voters, and most crucially, number 3, they are pre-electoral. They are based on usually a single survey question asked before the election, just one, and they're descriptive. You basically take the answers to that question and you tabulate using some kind of weighting. The pre-electoral aspect is very crucial because a lot of the evidence, and this is me picking on my colleagues, the political scientists, a lot of the evidence in survey methodology and about what works in surveys comes from post-electoral surveys, and those are very different animals. Pre-electoral surveys and posters know about that, how things change and how post-electoral surveys tend to have different dynamics from pre-electoral surveys. So the challenge here is to get data collected before the election to match what's going to happen in the election. So you don't know what happened when you collected, which is you do know in a post-electoral survey usually. So usually, and Fabian already mentioned this, the criticism towards polls in Latin America when they miss, that there's going to be either something wrong, technically speaking, or that there's political bias or even fraud, right? Usually that's the focus of the conversation. There are technical flaws, something in those 4 topic points that I have, that bullet points, something was wrong, should be done better, or it's being used for politics or for some other goal. And the assumption in that conversation, that's what I want to do today, is challenge this conversation in a way, because, and you all know we're all kind of, I think, on the same page here, that removing technical issues and removing political bias and fraudulent research will make the discrepancies go away. I'm here to say probably not. And probably not for what I've been calling with my friends, and I'm basically trying to use it to organize the conversation, what I call the Schrodinger's electorate. So where do I get this? Just from the classic Schrodinger's cat from quantum physics, the paradox. It's the idea that you have a cat inside of a box, a sealed box, and inside of that box, there's a device designed to kill the cat if some kind of subatomic event, usually a radioactive decay, happens. That's a random event. So there's a 50-50 chance that the cat with the box sealed could be dead or could be alive. So statistically speaking, you say that the cat is simultaneously dead and alive until you open the box. If the box is closed, you cannot directly observe the cat. The cat, statistically speaking, simultaneously 50-50 dead and alive. When you open the box and to see the cat can only be dead or alive. So it's basically a different state when you open the box. So there are these 2 aspects that I want to emphasize. First, you cannot observe the cat directly. It's just impossible epistemologically, right? It's not an option. And second, the act of observing the cat directly changes the state of the cat, philosophically speaking. So my point here is that trying to get polls to match electoral results, pre-electoral polls to match electoral results, is essentially trying to do the same thing, right? First, you cannot really observe the true distribution of votes because the votings have not been cast yet. usually to this point, there's an objection, which is, well, votes have not been cast, but preferences are already there. And there's burgeoning scholarship everywhere. And in Brazil in particular, you have some stuff being done to challenge that. Well, no, preferences do change, especially later in the race. First of all, we're talking, especially now, we're talking about campaigns that are more powerful than ever to reach voters. To first, not just reach voters, but identify which voters are more prone to changing their preference and getting to those voters. Campaigns are stronger than ever. You have social media, in particular, as a new tool compared to 20 years ago to get to those voters. And also you have, perhaps more important than that, new social groups, grassroots social groups that help certain candidacies do that. In the case of Latin America, back in the day, we used to think of unions in European context, as being able to reach voters for leftist parties. Now you have a massive growth of evangelical churches that are smaller everywhere and that can connect to voters more of a right-leaning position. So those groups are going to promote. We combine that with social media, with private messaging apps. You have a bomb. You really can change. You can get to voters and try to change preferences. So it's and sort of unreasonable to expect things to stay the same in this context. You also have a lot of different ways by which those campaigns can make it happen. So those changes can happen. You have strategic voting in the context of Latin America, multi-party systems, when races are structured with two main candidates and a lot of third-party candidates. We've seen this in Brazil repeatedly. When you have two clear leaders and a bottom group of third candidates, those candidates tend to be overestimated by polls and they actually lose votes because of these late switches. You have undecided proportions of undecided voters are growing in the US. They're growing everywhere when you ask those questions, even though we have this sense that polarization is growing. When you ask the questions, still a lot of people say they're undecided. You have abstentions, which are very hard to capture and usually are last-minute decisions. Most people don't clearly know. They don't have clear plans. They would like to turn out, but they don't. There's literature on that, not much on Latin America, but in the US, David Nickerson, other authors. And you have other waves, right? Candidacies that, because of asymmetries between candidacies, some candidates can produce a late wave through those mechanisms. Just to mention my paper with Felipe Nunes, published in Opinião Pública in Brazil in Portuguese in 2022, in the most polarized election in Brazil ever, between Lula and Bolsonaro. We ran an experimental study a week before the election, in which we assigned people to receive a 30-second ad. And we didn't focus on Lula or Bolsonaro voters. We focused on the rest. And and those messages were tailored to strategic voting, to importance of voting. Among that group of voters, about 10% of them changed to Lula, because those were pro-Lula messages in general, changed to Lula just by seeing a 30-second video. In one of them, the video conveyed poll results to try to foster strategic voting. So I think it's not, at this point, very reasonable and not empirically solid to suppose preferences are going to stay the same. Second point, in parallel with the Schrodinger's cat, is that publishing poll estimates changes the behavior of candidacies, most importantly, their strategies, and changes voters. The evidence of the jury about whether it changes voters' minds is still out there. There's research done on that, but it definitely changes candidacies. Everyone here who's been near a campaign for a candidate or for a party knows they rely on that data and what data conveys about groups to change their strategies, and then their strategies changes voters, so the effect is indirect. So we're talking, why is this reasonable? Why is the Schrodinger's electoral problem? We have a record number of polls being conducted in Latin America, so more than ever people know about those polls, and you have the horse race coverage of those polls. It's like journalists during elections have nothing else to do, no other problems in their countries. They just can't, the only thing they talk about is that. It's amazing. So you have those two things, and they create a problem for polls in Latin America as descriptive tools, which they are, which we use them for that, right? And here's the problem. It's possible that they get it wrong even when they get it right. Well, think about it. Even technically flawless and politically unbiased, if that's the case, if we have Schrodinger's electorates, even technically flawed research polls and unbiased polls, if we use them to try to predict the future, given that those changes are so common, and especially most of the region where you cannot poll in the last week, they are meant to miss the result. They are going to miss the result more often than not, because changes, at least in a part of the electorate, changing preferences is the more likely to be the norm, not the exception. So those polls, if you don't, they are likely, if you're just tabulating what you saw a week before the election based on one survey question of vote intention, that's going to be wrong. That's meant to be wrong, given the nature of things now. Second is what I call, and then posters like this. I'm going to go back. Posters like to use this often as an excuse. But here's the problem. When they are right, they say they're right. Well, when they're right, and just David Hume, Scottish philosopher, on miracles, right? If you see a miracle, if a poll gets it right 1 week before the election, what is more likely? That there was a miracle happen, nothing changed in the last week, or that they actually got it wrong and ended up getting it right because things changed in their direction, right? So what is more likely, right? What is more likely here? That a miracle happened or that the poster was wrong a week before the election? You tell me. I think I have my view on this. But at the same time, descriptive polls, and I'm going to claim here, they are more useful than predictive polls, than forecasts. They tend to be more transparent. They're simpler, easier to explain and to report than forecasts. So that's easier for voters and for everyone else. And that's easier to understand if what they say they're doing, I know it's complicated, but if you compare that to forecasting models, descriptive polls are considerably simpler, easier to report. Second, they provide you descriptive information that is valuable. They tell you how many voters are undecided, how many are picking third candidates, how many plan on spoiling their ballots, how those things change over time. So that's very useful. Voters should rely. When voters ask me what they do, what to do with polls, how to read polls, I tell them, read it as my last point. Read it to know how many people are undecided. Read it to know the changes over time. Read them to know rejection trends, right? Don't read them to know what's going to happen in the future. That's on Friday, my fantasy football, the Yahoo fantasy football website told me I was going to win this weekend by 20 points. My team, I lost it by 20 points. Right? So polls are going to be like that, right? And because things change, and I'm not a very good player, fantasy football. So then you have polls as prediction, right? It's pronosticos, right? That's the US. Welcome to the US, right? So here's the idea, right? Voters and journalists are obsessed with prediction. We tell them they shouldn't take them as predictions, but they want to do it. They want to know who's going to win. It's amazing. But then, given that they are not aware of the literature and all the study the stuff that I've been doing, they don't read that. Unfortunately, why don't we try to just give them what they want, right? That's the U.S. market, right? It's just giving forecast. Forecast may be useful, in some contexts. If you're gambling, and now that's very common, I guess, online. Forecast has those for markets is good, but for voters, forecast, I fail to see how it can be more important than actually knowing what's happening now, right? So that's the idea here. So using polls are not the only way to do forecasting, but you're basically using statistical modeling to try to predict changes in voting preferences. So going beyond the simple tabulation of that one survey question, you're using multiple questions, you're using additional information, you're using models to try to predict what's going to happen, how many people are going to abstain. So the examples in the US, two very common ones is likely voter models, trying to eliminate the non-voters from the survey, and allocation of the undecided. If you have 5%, 7% of undecided, you allocate them based on their propensities to go one way or another. So these are very useful, and this can help us if they're based on good theory and in good data. But there's problems here as well. And I'm in the US environment right now, where they do all these things very well in general. Problems. you have these models tend to be very complex, and they never really clearly show their assumptions. So we don't know, different polls are using different assumptions. So it is even less transparent in a way than if we're complaining about descriptive polls now and how transparent they are. This is considerably less transparent. And in the US, there's a problem because you don't know what assumptions they're making about likely voting, about how they assign undecided. So what exactly is being modeled? Usually the standard error for those things tend to just, my professor at Vanderbilt, Josh Clinton, says that in the US, you take the margin of error for a poll and you double it to get the actual margin of error as a rule of thumb. That's because you're modeling and you're changing the size of the data, and the standard errors are going to just sometimes just blow away. And we say in Latin America, the descriptive polls, the standard errors, the margin of errors are already problematic for other reasons. When it comes to doing projections like this, good luck with the standard errors. So there's an issue here. There's a trade-off. You lose a lot when you go in this direction, but at the same time, you give people what they want. So we should go this way. But how do we go this way, right? What I'm kind of, what seems to me like where we should be talking about is that if you want voters to really get it, you should do both. You should do both side by side, not just one like in the US, not just the second like the US, or just the first like in Latin America. Latin American posters should try to do forecasts and should provide those models and should tell the public they're doing that separately from giving the public a description. I think people will get it, and users, consumers will get it only if you separate those things and you report them separately. So the idea is that you should report them separately. If we only report the first description, they'll take it as prediction. If you only report prediction, will likely fail, and people are going to complain. We're still going to fail. Predictive models are still not there yet. In the US, predictive models, and there's a recent working paper by Justin Grimmer saying in the US, if you have a 50% margin and you're always there and your polls are always trying to get there, there's a problem is that they may be very good, but the problem is that a coin toss is already very good in the US context. And we just saw this happen this election, where they actually got a lower margin of error than in 2020 on average, but missed the result, the winner. So I think the idea is to communicate both, to embrace the Schrodinger's electorate and communicate both these things that are necessary. People want prediction. Let's try to do some kind of projection for them. And at the same time, people need description. The public and the consumers need description. Description is more important. I'm willing to fight that fight here. Description of voting preferences are more important. That should be done properly, and people should learn that they should read those. Yeah, and I'm going to end here. I think I'm done with my 15 minutes probably, so I'm not keeping track. Thank you very much. And I look forward to the conversation.
Thanks a lot. Muitíssimo obrigado, Fred. It was a wonderful way to frame and introduce the topics and bring details about some of the nuances. I knew that we were going to be talking about political issues, technical issues. I didn't expect to be talking about religion, but the miracle of getting it right is certainly deserves that that space in our discussion. So I'm glad that you bring it. It certainly is a challenge. It's a challenge that we those doing polls or doing public opinion studies, those doing analysis of public opinion studies face. So thanks again, Fred. If you could handle the hosting to Fernando.
He already.
Oh, super. So now we'll have Fernando's presentation. Fernando, the floor is yours.
Okay. So let me thank you, Fabian and Ryan, for the invitation to be here with you at the Wapor webinar. And I should say first that I don't have anything left to say after Fred he said it all. I'm going to repeat him a lot, probably. And I'll try to show some data that perhaps will reinforce some of his points. I agree with most of of them. I only disagree with the point of his Spanish and Portuguese, because as you realized, I didn't translate my slides, my presentation. I don't have any Spanish skills, so I hope you can follow my slides. But we can, of course, I can answer questions at the Q&A section. So the thing that Fred said, and I really agree, is that errors are common everywhere, and polls do make mistakes because we have many sources of error, included this time trend component of errors. Polls are usually take place before the election day, and during this time, voters can change their minds based on the information they get to know from polling. So we're following a path that will leads us nowhere. We can't make perfect predictions with polling unless we want to make assumptions, unless we want to assume that some things are going to be true, and based on that we extrapolate our polls. But beyond that, we can see in the US and in other countries as well, there is something else that is puzzling. Why do we have the impression that polls these days are only missing for one side? Why do we have this one-sided errors? As in the US, even though in this recent election, pollsters did a lot better, we still have this impression, but this is not something exclusively to the US. In Brazil, we also had in these two last presidential electoral cycles the same trend. The extreme far right candidate Jair Bolsonaro also was underestimated by pollsters in Brazil. Almost all of them took his vote share wrong. But the thing is, are these types of errors happening in Brazil and the US, elsewhere, common, and do they share the same logic? What is the thing that makes this kind of errors more prevalent? And what I'm going to focus here is in a certain way one part of the puzzle. I'm not going to cover it all. I don't think it's possible to cover it all. Freddy put it well. There's many sources of error, and voters can decide based on polls they know. So what I'm going to do here is to try to focus on this particular thing that I call non-voters. Non-voters are the people that when are interviewed, they tend to say that they're undecided, or they're not going to vote, or they're going to cast blank votes or null votes, invalid votes. I'll call this whole group of non-voters, and I should say that in most surveys in most countries, this group is underestimated. People usually say they're going to vote, but they're not going to vote at all. People say they will vote for some candidate, but they will nullify their votes. So we have this major trend of underestimation of non-voters. And if this group of non-voters, they break lines towards a right-wing candidate or towards a left-wing candidate, they can make systematic errors. In the US, there seems to be the case that one possible source of errors, of differences between pre-electoral surveys and electoral results, is related to non-voters. And I'll try to convince you that perhaps in Brazil, we are seeing the same thing, but for different reasons. So what is survey errors? To take a broader perspective of the survey total error, we are speaking of many possible sources of error, sampling errors that we can take care of, we can measure beforehand, we can estimate variance for our sampling designs and so on and so forth. But mainly in Latin America, but nowadays this is also the case in the US, we don't have probability sampling anymore. We have non-probability sampling. We have convenience sampling, we have people answering enumerators based on picking up the phone. So this is a decision you have to make up front. And we have measurement errors, wording, survey mode, all those types of errors. So we're not talking about the difference between surveys and electoral results, but things that can affect survey estimates. We can judge a survey based on the electoral results. Electoral results, as Fred said, is the result of the preferences of the electorate, but also the electorate getting to know the polls results, so they can strategically choose to change their vote intentions. And focus on political science, we have previous research showing that we have these types of errors that I'm listing here. The one I want to really emphasize here is this misreporting due to social desirability bias. Not only in Brazil, again, in many other countries, people, when asked by enumerators, tend to say they are really going to vote, even though they're not so sure, or if they're not going to vote at all. This is due to many factors, but there is a core factor underlying this phenomena where people are afraid to reveal to enumerators they're not going to vote. There is a social pressure. Specifically in Brazil, voting is mandatory. People are supposed to go to vote. But if you don't go to vote, we have small penalties. And so this is not, in practice, a mandatory voting system. So people are afraid or are not comfortable revealing they're not going to vote. So if these people, they're not really comfortable acknowledging they're not going to vote, are leaning towards left-wing candidate, for instance, they're going to inflate the estimates for this left-wing candidate, and vice versa. So what I'm trying to highlight for you here is that this logic of non-voters is not only important, but it is a different type of systematic errors. When posters go to the field to collect interviews, they're not only trying to guess it right, the vote intention of left-wing or right-wing candidates, but they also need to estimate non-voters. What is the size of the people that are not going to vote? What is going to be the turnout rate? And more than that, what is the size of the undecided group of voters, and to which side are they're leaning? So this non-voter problem is a big problem because it conflates many other specifics, and it's a big group, at least in Brazil. Abstention itself is getting out of hand. Election after election in Brazil, we're getting more and more people not turning out to vote, and the rate of undecided voters is as well increasing election after election. So we're talking about 1/3 of the electorate in Brazil, but this is something, again, that happens in other contexts. Well, I don't have any paper published on this, let's put this way. But I'm trying to work on this topic for a while, and for that reason, I assembled this data set of presidential pre-electoral polls in Brazil, considering both the first round of elections in Brazil and the second round. Brazil has this runoff system where two most voted candidates in the first round for the presidential elections go to the second round, and they face each other in this runoff. So we have polls at the national level for the first election round, the second election round, and we also have polls for the national level and the state level. Unlike the US, the election is not decided at the state level. We don't elect the delegates, but pollsters nonetheless conduct polls, survey research at the state level. We can use that data as well to evaluate systematic sources of error. So this is the data I collected. And just to give you a preview of this data, I have this plot here, the scatter plot, showing at the x-axis the polls estimate for the PT candidate. Why the PT candidate? PT run for every presidential election since the democratization in Brazil. So it's a stable benchmark we can evaluate surveys against. And in the y-axis, we have the actual PT vote share. This only considering the second round of presidential elections. So we just have two candidates, the PT candidates facing another candidate. Most of the time a right-wing candidate, but the party of this right-wing candidate and the identity of this right-wing candidate changes over time. But as you can see, we don't seem to have biases. Yeah, of course we have variation, but just looking at the data, it doesn't seem that PT is underestimated or overestimated. But if you look at this data differently, if we plot the distribution of errors, that is the estimates coming from the polls minus the actual PT vote share, we have this distribution. In this distribution, what we have is negative values shows underestimation of PT and vice versa. So this is puzzling because in the past we used to have an underestimation of the PT candidate, and in 2018 we had it again. So why do the aggregate vote count show that Bolsonaro was underestimated, but when we look at the PT candidate, he was also underestimated? The PT candidate was Fernando Haddad, an unknown name for most Brazilians. So as the rate of undecideds lowered during the election, most of them were people getting to know the PT candidate and breaking lines towards the PT candidate. So the undecided, the rate of the undecided is an important piece here. But for the 2022 election, the candidates are well known: Jair Bolsonaro, former president, and Lula, the PT candidate and former president. So here we don't have many undecided voters, but we do have a lot of people saying they're going to turn out to vote, but they're not turning out to vote. And what we have here is an overestimation of the PT vote share. Lula was, most people believe Lula would win in the first round of this election easily, and that just didn't happen. The thing is, we can really talk about this in terms of errors because we're conflating variance, sampling errors, and we're mixing this with the systematic errors. For that reason, some studies employing this methodology of modeling polls with an Bayesian hierarchical model to try to separate these two components of errors: systematic errors and a variance component. Think of the variance component as the error predicted by simple random sampling plus something plus some access variance. Why access variance? Because in Brazil and in other Latin American countries, we don't employ probability sampling. So we have non-probability sources of error, and pollsters usually use adjustments, weighting methods that inflate the margin of error. This is known as the design effect, but what it makes is that the effect of the design effects to make a margin of errors bigger than they are. So briefly, I'm not going to torture you with this. If you apply this model to Brazil, we can estimate the bias for each poll, separating it for the time trend component, so we can estimate the poll's bias at the election day. Of course, this is an assumption, right? We have to model this time trend and we have to make assumptions. But if you are willing to buy my assumptions, these are the election day estimates, the bias. And this is a little bit complicated. I agree with you. In the x-axis, I have the information of the size of the non-voters undecided plus people that are telling that are not going to vote minus the actual share of the non-voters. In Brazil, some people refer to that as the alienação eleitoral, but I'm calling this as the non-voter. So when this is negative, it means that polls are not measuring correctly the size of the non-voter electorate. And as you can see in 2018, bias in polls were slightly bigger when pollsters did a bad job trying to come up with a good estimate for the size of the non-voter electorate. I mean, this is something really visual, and at this point, I can't talk about the inference here. We can see these vertical lines. They're credible intervals. They're really big. I didn't came up with a better way to do this yet, but this is suggestive of the things I was talking about, the non-voter breaking lines towards one candidate or the other. In the case of the 2018 election, because the undecideds are getting to know the PT's candidate. And in 2022, we see actually the plot is not very clear here, but we also have some sort of relationship, but again, more suggestive than anything. Another thing that is interesting based on the model is that we can estimate the size of the bias in percentage points for all elections in Brazil, first and second round. I excluded 2 elections that didn't have second rounds, but you can see that the size of the bias is not that big. I mean, this is not comparable to the size of bias for the US as estimated by previous studies using the same methodology. It's a little bit bigger, but not that big. And it's bigger for the first round of elections, where we have many more candidates unknown to the electorate. But in the second round, things are a little bit more predictable. And some time ago, and I'm just finishing here, I put together some data from this study by Jennings and Welsing that collected survey data around the world. And I updated the Brazilian data to calculate this measure of error, comparing surveys against electoral results. And what we see here is that polls are not very far. If you take this metric as a metric of accuracy, but this is not right, as I said. But Brazilian polls are not very far from the US, and many other Latin American countries are close to the US. And the ones that are not, they have really different electoral system, and parties change, the candidates change. So this is not the environment of the US that is really structured, and it's more predictable than elsewhere. So taking that into account, I don't think that we're talking about different types of errors. So wrapping up, I think we do have things that we can improve as practitioners or as pollsters or as academics conducting surveys, but we're not very far from other markets in terms of quality. We do employ different methodologies, but I do agree with Fred that we can make a step forward by incorporating likely voter models, some forms of modeling to treat non-missing at random, because many people are not answering, not picking up the phones, are not really ready to give interviews to posters. But I think this is ongoing progress. We're getting to know more about this problem, so we can try to, in the future, implement solutions to handle that. That's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Fernando. Mais uma vez, super obrigado aí pela contribuição. That was an excellent presentation. Thank you for bringing in non-voters and the particular way that it influences the projections and calculus. And speaking of calculating, you said that you didn't have any publication about these different topics that you offer us, but I think you have at least three top articles there, and at least one of these could go to the Revista Latinoamericana. So maybe you can have a chat with Ryan after that. Certainly looks very promising. And please do keep sending your questions and answers. We already have a few for any of the presenters, or for the three, or for the floor. And please bear in mind that the recording will be available at our institutional website, waporlatinoamerica.org. Thank you again. And now we turn to Seth, our third presenter, right before jumping into the question and answers. So Fernando, if you could share the hosting with him, and Seth, we are all ears.
All right, I think it's already sharing. Is that right?
It is.
All right. Well, thank you so much, everyone. I'm very excited to be here, and I am sort of amazed by how much what I have to say lines up with what's already been said. I think similar things are on all of our minds, clearly. So I wanted to add one sort of additional element into the discussion, which it comes, basically everything it comes from a perspective of also sometimes dealing with candidates themselves, as well as dealing a lot with the press and the kind of questions they ask. And one of the things I think this discussion sort of highlights is, I think there are some kind of wild expectations about what surveys can actually do for us, right? Fred, many of your comments were about how forecasts and surveys are different things. And I constantly find myself explaining to reporters or to very angry candidates that, surveys measured what was going on in a population at the time the survey happened, which is a very different thing from what everyone wants them to be, right? It's not just that everyone's misguided, it's that we really want some certainty about what's going to happen in elections. And part of what elections are kind of randomizer boxes, right? If you know who's going to win in advance, it might not be a free and fair election with a secret ballot. So one of the things that the comments were just sort of reminding me of, so I added a slide, is quite a few of the things, of the events that have been called, especially in press accounts, gaps between surveys and elections. They're not always gaps. Fernando, the point estimates that you pointed out, the gap between Trump's results and the survey results, in 2024 was 1.6 percentage points. And it is, it's very interesting that there's this consistent underestimate, But I also kind of look at that and say, like, 1.6, as you highlighted, right? 1.6%, it's actually not that big, right? And so sometimes, you know, especially I think when there are frustrated expectations, very small gaps turn into a narrative about surveys being very different from election results. And it's always worth like exploring why they're different, but it's also sometimes the case that the numbers just aren't really what the narratives kind of say they are. And a few of the things that really matter when we're trying to understand whether there was a gap between election results and surveys are things like how much time actually elapsed, right? Most surveys, even the final round of surveys before an election, are in the field a week or more before the election, and a lot of people are deciding late. And also, you know, when we're exploring why certain candidates get underestimated, it's also worth exploring why in those same surveys, often one or two candidates are being very accurately estimated, right? Whatever explanation we're looking for might also need to be able to account for why some people are accurately measured while other people are inaccurately measured. And the other thing I'll kind of throw in is something that I'm not sure this is right. This is more an opinion or an intuition I have, but I think overestimates of candidate support are more consequential as far as things we need to look into and evaluate when we're comparing survey results to election results than underestimates of candidate support. And the reason boils down to the fact that in a survey, there are always people who say, I don't know. On election day, those people cast a vote. So there sort of should be systematic underestimates just from the gap in that process, but overestimates, I think, are a bit of a problem. But I am very curious what other people think about that specific claim. So if I had to break down why I have seen gaps between surveys and election results, they boil down to these 5 things, right? The survey and the election are different things. People make decisions later than the final surveys are in the field. There are undecided voters, but there are also trends in public opinion. And we're very bad about thinking of public opinion as a movable thing in that period between the final survey and election day, but it does move. It happens all the time. The populations are different. Often that's because of turnout. And you know, I work in a context where most people turn out to vote. Brazil is turning into a place where fewer and fewer people turn out to vote. And of course, American pollsters have it terribly, and they have to spend most of their energy thinking about how to deal with that problem. I put the kind of classic survey design questions fourth on the list because those are a very real part of making accurate surveys, but they're often not why there are gaps between election results and surveys. And because candidates in particular love to say that the reason they lost is that their opponents cheated, there are a few circumstances where actually maybe something really did happen and the votes that got into the ballot box are not the ones that were counted. That's pretty rare, but it does happen. And I'll briefly address situations where surveys might help you know whether that happened. So this might seem a little bit simple, but I think it's always worth reflecting on the really fundamental gap between an election and a survey. And that is that don't know is an option on surveys, and that even when don't know is taken away as an option, because you can run that in a survey, refusing continues to exist. And that creates a fundamental difference between what will happen when someone is interviewed and what they can do on election day. And unless they're in, I think, the US state of Nevada, right, they have to cast a vote for a person. I think in Nevada, you can say none of the above. So this is always going to generate a little bit of a gap. There are techniques, and they're pretty widely used to reduce it, like giving a simulated ballot. But even that, there are people who say, I don't know, I haven't decided yet. And they probably haven't. There are always the problem of people deciding late. This graph I put in basically an average, a trend line from the most recent Indonesian election. Basically every survey that was released in the final 3 weeks before the election day came up with a number for the winner that was 4 to 6 points below his final result. This freaked everyone out until they looked at basically this sort of trend line and said, gosh, if you just extended the trend line we were getting with our surveys an additional week, because the final surveys were out of the field by about 7 days before the election, they got a lot closer to the final number. So one of the sort of specific diagnostic tools that you can use when confronted with a large gap between surveys and election results is just to look at the date on the survey and look at any signs of trends in the final month, then just extrapolate them forward and see if that brings the kind of predicted number close to the final result. If it does, you can pretty confidently, I think, conclude that there was a late breaking trend, you picked up the first part of it, and it continued through the days the survey wasn't in the field. That'll also usually manifest in the gap kind of clustering towards one candidate. And someone in the chat asked, where do you allocate people who say they don't know? That's like the fundamental modeling challenge, but it is true often that the wrong answer is to proportionally allocate them based on what the survey has already done. They do tend, in a lot of different contexts, to go more towards one or two candidates and sort of not go to other candidates. But it's really hard to know which ones. It takes a lot of work to get even a vague estimate of it. Related to the processes being different, the populations are different. On election day, you do have to show up somewhere. During the survey, someone comes to you either on the phone or at your house. There are, of course, the problems of error and bias, the things that we are able to control, and so we spend probably the most time thinking about because it's within our power to improve them. Fred, your comments about fake polls reminded me that about 3 weeks ago in Jakarta, we actually kicked a very famous, well-respected pollster. I kind of had them at maybe number 4 or 5 as far as overall quality. We kicked them out of the professional association that kind of certifies, regulates public opinion bodies, because they produced a survey that was really out of line with the other surveys. And as that association requires, there's a process for saying, hey, just show us your data so we can check. We're not saying you're wrong. We just found your results strange. Please show us your data. And they couldn't. And it became pretty clear pretty quickly that they had falsified about 400 respondents in a survey to push the survey results towards their favored candidate, a candidate who, as everyone else's surveys showed, ended up losing about 3 weeks later. I think a very useful thing to sort of keep in mind when we're evaluating survey versus final result differences is that the more consistent a collection of surveys are with each other, the less likely it is that kind of standard sampling or questionnaire or social desirability bias issues are responsible for the gap, and the more likely it is that something like a momentum trend or something outside of either of these processes was affecting them. So I do think that one situation that sometimes occurs where it's worth kind of scrutinizing things a bit more is a situation where there is a big gap, but the polls heading into the election don't have a lot of don't know. So there's not much room for late movement. There are overestimates, especially large overestimates of a candidate or multiple candidates. Extrapolated trends from right before the election don't line up with the result. And you have high turnout. And high turnout is important because the higher the turnout, the more plausible it is to treat a voting age population survey as representative of who showed up on election day. And sort of surveyors agree, when all of these things are the case and something's weird about the results, then it's worth asking the question that every candidate who loses wants to ask, which is, did my opponents cheat? Was there fraud? Was the count fraudulent in some way? Now, I word this very carefully. Like, what they're asking is, might it be the case that the vote tally does not match the votes cast? And this could be because of fraud, like people deliberately did something to make those two things not line up with each other. But it can also happen because there are regions of the country that for one reason or another have a special procedure. Some of you may be familiar with these digit tests that get used sometimes to kind of allege, sometimes demonstrate the presence of fraud in election data. And several years ago, this was in the 2014 Indonesian presidential election, there were allegations that fraud had occurred. So I downloaded the data, well, I scraped it manually, it wasn't actually very easy, and decided to do some of these digit tests. And when I did a very simple thing, which was create a histogram of vote shares in polling stations, you'll notice in the figure on the right, there are two sort of sharp lines sticking out up above where the rest of the of these nice sort of normal distributions are. They're at 0 vote share and 100% vote share. And I saw this and I went to APSA and I said, I found fraud in the 2014 Indonesian presidential election. A very kind political scientist who knew a bit more about the country said, I think you may have found that Papua province is allowed to use a collective voting procedure. So just sort of a note here, the digit tests are really good at determining whether or not voting data comes from the kind of tally process you're expecting. That in and of itself is not a way of knowing for sure whether the tally was fraudulent. And you can see over here on the right, if you just remove the places where they were allowed to use collective voting, the strange numbers go away. In general, you know, candidates and sometimes the press are worried about fraud, but fraud leaves clues. It leaves clues everywhere. Large-scale fraud leaves large-scale clues. If you start thinking about the logistics, it might be hundreds of thousands of stations, thousands of people, some of them something, and they're going, the things they do to make the, and of course, if things are really out of control, there's going to be a lot of secrecy in the tally process, and we just won't see how the numbers were arrived at. So the places where you really expect this sort of thing to happen are not actually the places where we see a lot of polling. It's not the big national races where you need to change potentially 1 million votes. It's tiny little races like any legislative race in an open list proportional electoral system, such as Indonesia or Brazil has, where a few hundred votes can put you ahead of someone else in your same party to get the seat, right? Small races, few votes, tight margins, high stakes. These are the things that predict fraud. And these are also the things that predict very little polling. So in general, when people are complaining about fraud and saying, look, the election results don't line up with the polls, they're already usually talking about a kind of race where it's unlikely that a lot of fraud has taken place. But there are ways of looking for it, and there will be a lot of clues if it's usually the case. Most of the time it's sour grapes. So these all together give us, I think, a framework for thinking about when not our survey is going to be accurate forecasts, but when should we kind of expect survey results to be pretty close to final results? And it's when these 5 conditions are met. It's when there aren't a lot of people who say they don't know. It's when there aren't strong trends in the final weeks, really, of the election. It's when the country has very high turnout quite consistently, so we don't need likely voter models. It's when different surveyors using different survey modes are getting similar results. And it's when the count is being done with integrity and there are no regions that use special procedures. And with that, turn the time back over to Fabian.
Amazing, Seth. I think that it wouldn't be possible to supplement and complement the previous discussions. How do we agree on that? So your spontaneous planning of the topics, I think, rounded up beautifully, and certainly giving room for I'm picking up just one single diamond of those that you thrown. Giving room for the don't knows, no answer is quite critical. I'm thinking that, for example, in Brazil, in the last municipal election, the number of undecideds till the very last minute was double than the historical average, was nearly 40% in capital cities such as Sao Paulo, which is the largest South American urban center. So how do you, what a challenge to project and run different models of distributing those undecided for candidates when there is such a magnitude of people, big magnitude of people still not decided, or at least arguing that they or not willing to open their preference. So thanks again, and now we open the floor for question and answers. Ryan Carlin, who is the editor of the Revista Latinoamericana de Opinión Pública, Wapor Latin America official journal, and beautifully indexed and also very much used as a source for citations in public opinion and political behavior literature, will manage the session on question and answers. And now that we have a few questions, so there will be food for thought from the audience. So.
Thank you so much, Fabian. Thank you to Fred, Fernando, and Seth for excellent presentations. When I thought about the questions I would ask you beforehand, they're so different than the discussion we're having now. So I'd like to start perhaps with some of the questions we got from our audience. The first one is actually from Monica Molina. I think this is a good one. You touched on some of the others throughout, but this is, I ran this through Google Translate just to make my life easier. And it kind of refers to Fred's discussion, which I think a lot of people maybe could identify with. And it says, in the case of when surveys are consumed mainly by political actors who tend to want to read the results that suits them, how could the process of educating the public, how could we design the process of presenting the results to the public? Why did this translate didn't do very well for me? How could this education process be when presenting the results and making the difference between description and prediction? In other words, how can we tell the public, hey, this part is descriptive and this other thing that's going on here is prediction, and we should treat them differently? How can we make that easier?
Can I go?
Yeah, let's go for you, Fred, and then if others have ideas, I'd love to hear them.
Sure. Yeah. So I think, again, I'm going to lean very strongly on the descriptive side here. I think candidates should be asking about descriptive questions. I think if you are talking to the candidate, you should tell the candidate should be thinking, and the campaign should be thinking about which voters are up for grabs and what issues they should be talking about for which voters. That comes from the descriptive part of the poll. They should be reading that. If they want to know who, and the other part is who's going to win by how much in the future, I think we can give it to them. But say they have 5% of vote intentions, they should be able to read that in the descriptive part, that their chances are not looking very great. But if they're close, right? If you're somewhere close to the finish line, we can present them their chances with modeling and to tell them it's worth keep going, it's worth spending more money. But we have to tell them, as we would do for voters and for journalists, the amount of how confident we would not be on that, right? Or be explicit about, look, we think your chances are these because we modeled and we have these assumptions here, and we think you will benefit from abstention, something like that. So it's a matter, and I think candidates, we should convey both to candidates, like to voters, but especially for candidates, it is the descriptive part. The campaign should be worried about which voters are out there. I think it only makes sense for a campaign to know if they're going to win, if they're close, and they want to know their chances. They want some kind of estimate of their chances to decide if they're going to put more money. But that's very rarely the case. It's only if you're really close, right? If they're really running low on voting intentions, they should be able to grasp that from the just the basic, like your mom and your auntie are gonna vote for you, nobody else. So that's the scenario. So I think description it is more important, and the forecast, we should convey that very carefully to people, because in some cases, only in very few cases, it makes sense. I think for candidates, it's only when they're deciding if they're going to spend more money, get more donors to spend more money. But those are not really very often the case. So in those situations, we might tell them this is how it's useful for you. Otherwise, they should be looking at where to get votes, and because that's what gets you to win.
Thank you, Seth or Fernando. Would you like to, or even Koti or Fabian, join in on this?
I agree with Fred. I guess the scripted part is the most important, not only for the candidates, I should add, but for the public as well. You usually want to know, why is the left-leaning candidate so uh, doing so great in the polls, and you always look at subsamples to find answers. Who are the demographics voting for this candidate, and so on and so forth. So this is helpful not only for candidates, but for journalists. We want to know who these people are, and the descriptive is exactly that. It's telling you who these people voting are.
Thank you. Anything, Seth? Yeah.
Oh, I would just add, I agree basically completely with everything you said. And I would just add, at least when dealing more with the general public, I think it would be good, and I count myself among people I'm giving this suggestion to, it would be good to really foreground the date of the survey, just say like, this was the situation, kind of refer to them more in the past tense, and sort of refer to the date.
Thank you so much. We had an interesting question that was touched on maybe a little bit, but maybe not so much. And this comes from whom? Let me see. This is yeah, from Lenin Cadena. Thank you, Lenin. Here he asks, in recent elections, surveys have been put out through, social networks, more and more frequently. What do you think about them? And is it possible? They say, that with adequate stratification and subsequent weighting, we can deal with these issues of misrepresentation. What do you think about this? And is this a pathway forward? And this can be for anybody.
I can go for it.
Oh, go ahead, Fred.
Oh, sorry, Seth. So I was partially trained by Josh Clinton, who is specialized in polls, to be a Bayesian statistician in a way. And my motto is never say no to data. I think that's a good place to get data on public opinion, as long like any kind of collection mode, as long as we know what we're getting. So in the developing context, online samples are gonna it's gonna really be difficult to sample certain subgroups of the population that are large. Some posters that do online sampling, and I've hired for my studies, some of them, they struggle to match quotas sometimes. So which tells you there's only so much post-certification weights can do. We got to be aware of that. The other thing is self-selection. You may be getting a very specific type of respondent that's willing to click on something and say yes to answering a questionnaire in this online environment. That is different from having an interviewer knock on your door, and you kind of you don't feel as good saying no, comfortable saying no, so you end up opening the door. So we got to understand those issues. So, and be creative with online sampling, because in a way, and here's the part where I think it may be useful, is that some of these movements that we see, these waves, these late shifts, they start online, and a lot of that communication starts online. And that kind of information in those surveys may be useful to capturing who's going to get somewhere using social media, for example. So there's definitely data that we can't ignore, and that if it's possible, incorporate. But we got to be aware that it's not like this magical solution. It has limitations. Some people claim it's better for, and Seth touched on this, to get people to say the real answer, but the jury is really out there. It's really not the evidence that people lie about who they're going to vote. It's really unclear, the shy voting. The evidence really mixed. It's an interesting theory. In some contexts, it makes sense, but the evidence tends to be mixed at best for that. So it's really, I think the basic feature when people say they don't know is Converse 1964. 60 years old publication. Am I right about that? It's 60 years old. Ambivalence, incoherence. People don't care about politics nearly as much as we here do. So they say they don't know, and they actually don't know, which doesn't mean they're not leaning one way or another, but they're just not sure. And that's a valid answer to give. We should allow people to give that answer more often. Anyway, so that's my take. I think never say no to data, but just take it critically.
Thanks, Fred. Seth, you had an idea.
Yeah, so I had the kind of specific thought was just that whether online surveys work, I think so far depends on kind of country by country. Like there are definitely places where they are working really well. I mean, it's been like 15 years, I think, since Gelman did the Xbox study. So like that was a thing that could be done in the US, but I can tell you that in Indonesia, some of the specialized online sample loaded panel providers have started to be able to get nationally representative samples, but they are missing certain locations, and luckily those are locations without a lot of people. I think the ones on social media platforms I'm quite wary of. I think they're very hard to get right. But online panels are going to be like a permanent feature of surveys everywhere in the world, and they're going to get better as everyone comes online. One note on those, though, is anytime you're using a full quota sampling, you are making a lot more assumptions about your ability to know the proper quota than you have to make when you're using probability sampling. So, probability sampling does kind of outperform, at least at a theoretical level, for that reason. And the other thing is, and Fred, you said this too, that like you might get certain kinds of people responding, but I keep thinking about the ways that people who answer political questions in certain contexts are different from other people. We had a survey experiment in Indonesia fail. I mean, well, it failed in the sense that it generated an effect in the wrong direction of the one that happened. And when we went back to figure out why did people who were responding to the survey respond in the opposite way from how the electorate at large seemed to respond when the event happened, it was very clear that the only people who understood the question were people who pay close attention to politics, and those people reacted very differently to this specific item than everyone else. And so I think that kind of dynamic is a really serious risk in online surveys as well. People who answer questions about politics online might be weird.
Thank you so much. We had a question specifically about Fernando's notion of non-voters, and here Monica Molina asks, what changes might you consider that are, something we could, what are the possible changes in the design of the survey that could be made in order to obtain more information or the right information to detect these probable voters and probable non-voters?
This is a great question, and to try to give some answers, I'll use my experience working at Quest, a polling firm in Brazil, where we use likely voter model. We do that to try to estimate who is actually going to vote. This is something really important in Brazil. As I mentioned, we're talking about the big size of the electorate. And we have many options to model likely voters. In the US, we have different models, and some of them use actual questions to gauge interested in politics, knowledge of political landscape, and so on and so forth. And in Brazil, we also have this geographic dimension. We want to measure if some people are not only willing to go into vote, but if they have access to a polling place. They have means to reach to a polling place. Considering that we have many cities in the country that are not really accessible for most people. So we can combine this kind of questions. We can use historical turnout data. In Brazil, we have good data on historical patterns by demographic of turnout rate. So we can use this information to create some kind of likely voter model. And with this model, we have a different source to classify someone as a likely voter or not. We don't depend exclusively on what people say. So some people say they're going to vote for a candidate A or B or C, but his or her probability of going out to vote is really low. So we can, after weight the data using this turnout probabilities to get to better estimate whatever it means. I mean, we try to reduce the gap between the survey and the electoral results, but this is just one part of the puzzle.
And Ryan, just a second, based on what Fernando said, Seth's point about the trouble of doing online surveys, getting people to click when they are on social media and different websites, is that if you want to model something like this that Fernando is talking about, you need to collect a lot more information about these people. And just random people clicking on things online, they are not very willing. They're willing to answer questions, but they're not very willing to spend that much time giving you all that information. And you can't really know where they are, if you don't go to their house. So my experience from a PhD, for my dissertation, I use Facebook to collect answers for a study. And in the middle of the study, I added a screener question based on the Berinsky paper, like asking, if you're reading this, mark blue below, and then there's a question, several options in the color, and one of them is blue. And I got like less than a third of my sample to click the right color generally. So these people are not reading. So this is the challenge of some of those the online polls, is that you need to get people to pay attention and give you answers. These people, they want to do it, but they don't want to spend as much time. A lot of them are not reading. Only the more interested ones are reading, which you got to know what's happening and look at it critically, which speaks to Seth's point. The online panel from a sample they already know, they've given you answers before. That's perhaps a better way of doing it. So it really depends on the online sample that you're dealing with.
Thanks so much. I think that's all the time we have today. I have lots of other questions that I'd love to ask you all at some point, and hopefully I have a chance to do that. Fabian, do you have any closing words?
Yeah, thank you, Ryan, for handling so masterfully the question sections. And again, thanks a ton to the three speakers. Particularly Seth, that is now 1 a.m. where he's based, and he's still not only awakened but answering very thoughtfully every single question. So again, we truly appreciate your effort and commitment. And it wouldn't. I know that it won't make a difference trying to persuade you to attend our Congress, but maybe you could you could catch up with all the activities at Wapor Latam now and in the future. Speaking about the Congress is April 28 to 30, Abril del 28 al 30, in the city of Florianópolis, south of Brazil. It's a beautiful city island with lots of things to do in addition to attending the conference. The papers will be accepted in Spanish, Portuguese, and also presentations in English. And this last webinar of the year has been quite successful. I was mentioning that we had a little more than 160 registered people. Usually we have one fourth, one third of the registered people actually attending on time, on the day, the webinar, and the rest catching up with the recording. And we had over 50 people, 55 actually at the baseline. So we achieved the one third figure. And the recording will be available in maximum 48 hours at our website, waporlatinoamerica.org. So thanks again. Hope to see you, some of you at least, not only the speakers, but also the attendant, the audience at Florianópolis next April for, again, another incredible discussion, not just on voting and electoral polls, which of course are part of the agenda, but about so many other relevant topics of the public opinion research agenda. Have a great end of the year, and we'll see you in 2025.